Hey guys, this is Maniac Mike 2 with the second part in the low stakes strategy series. In this video we're going to look at the early and the middle game, so that's basically up until the 2550, 5100 level, and in any case anything pre-bubble. So during low blinds 1020 and 1530, as we saw in the first video, you have to be playing tight cautious plus. You're only raising premium hands and you're proceeding very cautiously both pre and post flop. On page 34 of my strategy guide, I've put together a raising and re-raising ranges chart, which means that you have to be very tight when folded to, and even tighter when there's a raise or limpers ahead of you. Now, it's very important that whenever you use a chart like this, that you keep a couple of things in mind. First of all, that you have to remain flexible and that you have to adjust yourself according to in-game circumstances. So it's really important that whenever you use a chart that you remember that this is not set in stone, and you always have to be able to deviate from the chart whenever specific circumstances require so. So for example, if you are facing a couple of very tight players in the blinds, you really have to open up your hand range from late position, and you have to make a lot more steal raises with a wider range of hands than is suggested by the chart. So always remain flexible and adjust yourself to in-game circumstances. Secondly, what is your level of experience? When you are a beginning player, I suggest that you stick as much as possible to the chart that I presented in my strategy guide, because it will usually keep you out of trouble, and you will rarely find yourself in a situation where you have top pair in the weak kicker, or second pair with some kind of a draw and your opponent bets out or raises you and you are unsure what to do in that situation. So by contrast, if you are an intermediate or advanced player, you can really open up your hand range and play more hands than is suggested in the chart, because of the fact that your experience allows you to make tougher decisions post-flop and navigate your way more easily through those tough spots. Thirdly, and that's a connected point, is do you trust yourself to play post-flop poker? If you really do trust yourself to play post-flop poker, you can really open up your hand range and play a lot more hands, because you can be pretty confident that you are able to outplay your opponents post-flop if this is necessary. By contrast, if you are not that confident in your post-flop abilities, then it's probably better to stick to the chart as much as possible and only raise premium hands. As we also saw in the first video, you can always get it in pre-flop with Queens Plus during low blind levels. And Jacks Plus and Ace King is fine as well, but it's really important to note that you have to avoid probable flips. So whenever you have Ace King, it's usually fine to get it in pre-flop during low blind levels in low stakes games, but you have to have some kind of extra evidence that the majority of your opponent's range is consisting of hands that you dominate rather than consisting of pocket pairs, because you really don't want to be in a situation where you're coin flipping early on for your entire stack with a hand like Ace King against a pocket pair, because ICM tells us that you need to be a significant favorite when you get all in during low blinds. So being at a 50-50 hand is not really going to be enough. So you really have to have some extra evidence that you're probably up against a hand that you dominate when you get it all in pre-flop with Ace King. So a good example is this hand where I pick up Ace King offsuit in the big blind, and it gets folded around to the button, who makes it 200 to go, so 10x raise at the 1020 level. And first of all, it's very important to note that this constitutes really a promise to call. Whenever someone raises 10x during these low blinds, he's not going to fold if I stack it all in here. So that's the first thing to note, that this is really a promise to call. Secondly, looking at his bet sizing, it's fair to assume that he's probably got a hand that he's very uncomfortable playing post-flop, but that is pretty decent nevertheless. So this is most likely a hand like Ace Queen, Ace Jack, Ace 10, possibly King Queen. And there are also some pocket pairs in his range, like nines to jacks, but since unpaired hands occur more frequently than paired hands, the vast majority of his range will consist of hands that I completely dominate. So overall, I stand to be a significant favorite in this hand. And the only thing I can really do is just stack it all in here, because as I said, he's probably going to call when I just stack it all in. And flat calling is not really an option because I'm forced to play my ace-king offsuit out of position. And if I call, the pot is going to be 400 chips or something, so I'm more or less committing myself anyway to the pot. So folding is out of the question as well, because I stand to be a substantial favorite. I could make a smaller 3-bet, but in this case this is not really an option either, because if I raise to 600, I'm committing myself no matter what happens anyway to the pot, so it's irrelevant whether I make it 600 or just raise it all in here. So I just push with my ace-king. He calls, and he actually has ace-jack, so I did have him dominated pre-flop. So this is a good example of a situation where it's perfectly fine to get it all in pre-flop with ace-king when ever someone raises such an amount that you can be pretty confident that the vast majority of his range consists of hands that you completely dominate, rather than that you're probably flipping against a pocket pair. As we saw before, you have to be playing pretty loose in playing your speculative hands. So this means that you have to open limp any pocket pair from any position. So even if you pick up a hand like pocket deuces under the gun, it's very important that you just limp that hand in a low stakes game, because it's going to be profitable to play hands like that in early position. Just because of the fact that your opponents are generally going to be so weak that the implied odds that you're getting are so huge that it makes it profitable to play a hand like that. You would only not limp a low pocket pair like that from early position when you're at a table with a lot of loose and aggressive players and with a lot of raises pre-flop. So you don't really want to limp a small pocket pair when there's a fairly high chance that someone will raise behind you and you will have to fold your hand. Okay, so also you have to call raises with medium pocket pairs whenever you get good pot odds. So whenever someone raises 2x or 2.5x at the 10, 20 or 15, 30 level, or someone raises 3x and there's a call ahead of you, you can really call with medium pocket pairs with such good pot odds. Depending on the types of opponents that are in the hand, you can also call these raises with hands like suited connectors or suited aces and kings and Broadway cards, really hands that can flop really well. And this is a very important point, that the fishier the opponents who limp or raise and the better pot odds that you're getting, the wider you should limp behind and call with speculative hands. So you should really tailor your play according to the types of opponent that have already entered the pot. So the fishier the opponents that entered the pot already are, the wider you should limp behind and call with a number of hands. So this is really important to just pay attention to the types of opponents that have already entered the pot, and widen your range the fishier the opponents are that already entered the pot. So that's really important to note. So a good example of that is this hand where I pick up King 4 suited on the button, and this very loose player in early position limps, and he has a VPIP of 53% and a pre-flop raise of 16 and an aggression factor of 1.8, so he's very loose and passive. And my Hold'em manager put some player icons here, as you can see, and this player is labeled as a fish as well as this one, and if I look behind me, there's a whale in the small blind, which means some kind of a super fish, let's say, and he has a VPIP of 77%, so he's even more he's even looser than these two guys. So this guy limps as well, and it's really important that I limp behind here, because I can expect to play a multi-way pot with a couple of very loose and passive players, and I really want to get involved because of the fact that they are so loose and passive that they are bound to pay me off whenever I do hit a nice flop. And even though this is not such a great hand because of the fact that it is a high card and low card combination, so whenever you flop a pair of kings, you have a very weak kicker, and whenever you pair your 4, it's going to be either a bottom pair or second pair at the very best. So such high card low card combinations are not that great, but it's a suited hand, so that adds a lot to my equity. And there's also the off chance that I might hit 2 pair or trips on the flop. But the most important point in this hand is really that the opponents that I'm facing here are so loose and so passive that I really want to play a hand like this when I have good position and it only costs me 20 chips to play the hand. So it's important to not really use your auto fold button every time you play a low stakes game and you're up against a lot of fish at your table, and to really evaluate every single situation whenever the action gets around to you. So do not use your auto fold button, and just evaluate every situation separately and see if it is profitable to play a certain hand. So we limp behind and there's nothing really there for me on the flop, so it gets checked around. I do pick up a gut shot here, but whenever this guy bets out for half the pot and he gets 2 calls, I'm not really that interested in calling behind here, because there are 2 clubs out there, so that more or less counterfeits the 10 of clubs on the river for a potential out, and the board is paired as well. So this is not really a spot to keep involved, and the best thing to do here is to just fold and get out of the way. So, but the point really here is to get involved with hands that appear to be very marginal, but definitely have some kind of equity when you're up against very passive and loose players who are likely to make a lot of mistakes post flop, and whenever you do hit your hand, they're very likely to pay you off. So make use of those implied odds and play speculative hands like this when you're at a table with a lot of loose and passive players, like in this situation. Alright, so it's also very important to complete the small blind very liberally with around the top 70% of hands when there are limpers ahead of you. There are not that many players who actually do this, but it's really important that you do that in low stakes games, because of the fact that you get such great pot odds in a small blind when it only costs you another 10 or 15 chips to play a pot, and especially when you're at a table with a lot of loose and passive fish. It's really important to make use of these great pot odds that you're getting and complete the small blind very liberally with a very wide range of hands, and you would only fold really garbage hands that have absolutely no potential to connect with a flop. But for the rest, you just play like the top 70% of hands in the small blind. So an example of that is this hand where I pick up 8 deuce suited in the small blind, and there are 2 limpers ahead of me, and right off the bat it's important to note that they have very high VPIPs, 50 and 44%. And very low pre-flop raise percentages, so they are very loose passive, and I really want to get involved with players like this. So even though I only have 8 high, my hand is suited, so it does have some potential. I can flop a flush, and there's also of course the possibility that I flop 2 pair or trips. So it's really important to get involved here with a hand like this against such loose and passive players who are likely to pay you off whenever you do hit your miracle flop. Of course, it's not very likely that I hit my hand here in any way, but it doesn't need to be likely either, because I'm getting 7-to-1 pot odds, which are really good pot odds, and I really need to make use of these good pot odds to play a hand like this, and especially when I'm up against such poor opponents who are likely to pay me off whenever I do hit the flop. So I just invest another 10 chips to complete the small blind here, and I do hit the flop in somewhat way. I have a second pair here, but I'm not really happy with this flop. It's not really the flop that I'm looking for, so I'm just going to check and see what happens. There's no reason for me to really bet out here when the pot is only 80 chips. It's not really worth picking up at this point, so I'm just happy to check here and see what develops. Okay, this guy bets out for the entire pot, so gets 2 calls as well, so I'm happy to just get out of the way here and fold. But this hand is just very, very important to show that you have to complete the small blind very liberally with really a very wide range of hands, and you would only fold absolute garbage hands that have little or no potential to connect with the flop, such as deuce 3 offsuit or 7 deuce offsuit, something like that. But 8 deuce suited is good enough to call here in this situation. Whenever the blinds increase, you can really look at it as a smooth continuum. So this means that when the blinds are still low, your hand selection is going to be very tight. You only play premium hands for a raise, and the aggression and the amount of risk that you take is going to be pretty low. This is because of the fact that the blinds are still pretty low, so the pots are going to be small, and there's not really a reason to take a lot of risk and display a lot of aggression to try and take those pots down. This is really a risk-reward ratio thing, and you can really be pretty cautious during low blinds and not take that many risks post-flop. Whenever the blinds increase, with every blind increase actually, your hand selection goes down, so you start to play a lot more hands and open raise with more hands than during low blinds. And the amount of aggression and the risk that you take is going to go up. Because of the fact that with every blind increase, the pots are going to be bigger, so they're going to be more worth picking up, and you have to increase the amount of risk that you take, and so you're going to make some more continuation bets when you miss the flop, and you're going to make some more check raise semi bluffs, stuff like that. So you're just increasing your aggression and the amount of risk that you take. But it's important to note that switching gears, which is actually one of the most difficult things to master when you want to become a good sit-and-go player, but switching gears goes more slowly in low-stakes games than in medium and high-stakes games, because of the fact that whenever the blinds get higher, you still have to play pretty tight and pretty cautiously in low-stakes games. So you do not switch gears as fast as you would in medium and high-stakes games. So that's pretty important to bear in mind, that switching gears is something that you need to do also in low-stakes games, but it goes to a much slower pace than in medium and high-stakes games. So during medium blinds 2550 and 5100, you have to get a little bit more aggressive and play more hands, but as I said, still play pretty tight and cautious. It's important to scale back limping at the 2550 level because of ICM reasons. ICM tells us that the more chips you have, the less they are worth individually, and the less chips you have, the more they are worth individually. So at the 2550 level, when you have about a starting stack and your stack is getting a little bit more shallow in relation to the blinds, it's going to be more costly to limp that hand because of ICM reasons. So you have to scale back limping a little bit, but you still have to play speculative hands against fish. So it's still perfectly fine to limp hands at the 2550 level when there are fish involved in a pot. So scale back limping, but still get involved with very poor opponents when they are at your table. It's very important to note that 2550 pot commitment can really become an issue now. So you don't really want to chase any draws or float too often, and consider the pot to stack ratio. So whenever you find yourself in a pot where you limp pre-flop, or you perhaps call a raise pre-flop, and your opponent bets out and you have some kind of a draw, or you think that you can float this opponent and call and try to take it away from him on the turn, you have to realize, you have to think about what the size of the pot is going to be on the turn if you do decide to make that call, and consider in what measure this commits you or your opponent to the pot, because very often you will not be in a position where you can actually still play some poker because of pot commitment and pot to stack ratios. And you have to always consider what the size of the pot is going to be before you decide to chase your draw or float your opponent. So pot commitment can really become an issue as from the 2550 level. It's also very important to always decide what your intentions are before you make your raise. So at the 2550 and 5100 level, you will often find situations where there are opponents in the big blind or in the small blind who are pretty short stacked with a stack of around 10 to 15 big blinds, and usually they're either going to fold or re-raise all in. At this point, you should never be in a situation where you raise pre-flop from the button or the cutoff, and one of the opponents behind you is raising all in, and you are unsure what to do. You should never be in this situation that you actually have to think about if you're going to call or fold. You should really decide this pre-flop before you make your raise, and decide whether you're going to call your opponent when he moves all in, or whether you're going to fold. And it's important also to manipulate your bet size in this situation. So whenever there's a short stacked opponent and you have a hand that is good enough to raise and call an all-in with, then you can raise a little bit more, so that whenever your opponent does raise all-in, you're giving yourself better pot odds to call, so the decision is going to be pretty easy. And by contrast, if you're thinking of raising and folding to an all-in, it's probably better to just make a little bit of a smaller raise, so that it doesn't cost you as much, and that the pot odds that you're getting are significantly worse whenever your opponent does stack all in. So you have a pretty easy decision, and you can just fold. So manipulating bet sizes in these kinds of scenarios is also very important. So at the end of this video, we're going to look at some example hands that relate to the strategy concepts that we talked about, and that illustrate some common situations in low stakes games. So here I pick up King 10 suited during the 10-20 level, and the player in first position open limps. And right at the bat, it's important to note that he is a calling station with a VPIP of 37%. And there are a couple of very loose passive fish behind me with VPIPs of 50+%. So with a hand as good as King 10 suited, it's really important that you just limp behind and get involved with in a situation where you can expect to play a multi-way pot with a couple of big fish and with a hand that has a lot of post-flop potential. So again, do not use your auto fold button with whenever you see a hand like King 10 in the cutoff and you're not intending to play that hand, but only evaluate that hand whenever the action gets to you, and whenever there are a lot of big fish at your table. So with such big fish at the table, any hand is worth playing in some circumstances. So that's really important to keep in mind. So I'm happy to just limp behind here, and this is what I expected. These two loose and passive players are just limping behind, so it's a perfect situation where you can see a five-way pot and with a very decent hand, and you only have to invest 20 chips to potentially gain a 100 chips pot. So it's a pretty good situation. I have two overcards to this flop, but whenever this guy bets out for almost the entire pot, it's an easy fold, especially because of the fact that his aggression factor is 1.7. So this probably means that he has some kind of a hand here, because he's more likely to check with low aggression factor like this. So I'm happy to just get out the way here and fold my King 10. But this is a good example of that you should be really getting involved with a wide range of hands early on when it's cheap to play and there are a lot of fish at your table who are likely to get involved in that specific hand. So here we pick up pocket tens in the big blind, and it gets folded around to the button, who makes the 3x raise. And looking at his HUD stats, this is a loose and aggressive fish. So he has a VPIP of 53% and a pre-flop raise of 25%. He's very aggressive post-flop as well, with an aggression factor of 6.0. And his steal factor is 31%, so he often makes steal raises from late position. Against a loose and aggressive fish like this, it's really important to note, first of all, that I'm probably way ahead of his opening range here, because he's playing so many hands. My pocket tens figured to be way ahead of his range, but at the same time I'm out of position, and I don't really want to 3-bet here, because if I 3-bet to 180, I can be pretty sure that my opponent is going to call this 3-bet, because when someone is so loose and so aggressive, he's not going to fold to a 3-bet all that often. So whenever I make a 3-bet here to 180, I'm going to have to play my pocket tens out of position for a fairly big pot against a very loose and aggressive opponent. So this is not really something that you want to do. So the best option really here against this type of opponent is to just flat call and see what the flop brings. And it's a pretty good flop for pocket tens, 3, 6, 7. It's somewhat connected, and there are two diamonds out there. So I really need to protect my hand here for potential overcards coming on the turn, a Jack, Queen, King, or Ace, and any card like 4 or 5 is going to be pretty bad as well, and another diamond in some way, even though I do have the 10 of diamonds. But it's important to just protect my hand against this aggressive opponent, because if I'm going to check, he's most likely going to bet, because he has 100% flop continuation bet percentage, so he's going to continuation bet with his entire range probably, and he's very aggressive as well, with an aggression factor of 6.0. So if I'm going to check, he's going to bet with his entire range, and I have no idea where I stand at that point. So it's really important to bet for value, as I can expect to have the best hand at this point, and for protection, to protect from overcards and diamonds hitting on a turn, and for information as well, to see what my opponent does, if he's raising, calling, or folding. So I bet out close to the pot, so it's important to not bet too small, because if you bet like 60 or 70, it's very likely that this aggressive opponent is going to raise you and try to bluff you off the hand. So a pretty significant bet is in order here, so I'm going to bet 100. He calls, and there's a queen on a turn, which is not a great card because it's an overcard to my pocket tens, but considering how loose and aggressive my opponent is, I still figured it to be ahead of his holding at this point. So there's another flush card coming in, so it's still pretty important to bet here to protect my hand, and to really continue to show some aggression, because when I check here, again, my opponent is so aggressive that he's probably going to bet regardless of what he has. So if he has a hand like Ace 10 or Ace Jack, he's probably going to bet anyway. So it's really important that I just keep on firing and see if I can take it down, and I probably have to give it up when I get raised here, but it's really important to just keep the aggression going against a player like this, and just bet out again. Just a little bit over half the pot. There's not really a reason to bet anymore, because he either has it or he hasn't in this spot. So 200 will be enough, and he actually folds, and we take it down. So against loose and aggressive players, play pretty cautiously early on when the blinds are still low, and do not get yourself into a lot of tricky situations with hands like pocket tens, because you can put yourself in a lot of difficult spots post-flop when facing such a loose and aggressive opponent like this one. So here I have pocket fives in the small blind, and the guy under the gun makes it 2.5x and raises to 50, and his VPIP is 50% over 111 hands. So this is pretty high, and his pre-flop raise percentage is 41. So he's playing a lot of hands and raising a lot of them, and he's a very loose aggressive fish. This guy is pretty loose passive, and he calls behind. So this is really a perfect spot for me to get involved and just pay the extra 30 chips and see a pretty cheap flop against two very loose aggressive and loose passive fish. I had a perfect flop with middle set, but the board is somewhat coordinated and dangerous, because there are two diamonds out there, and there is a possible straight out there as well. So it's pretty important to just bet out here, because I want to protect my hand when I'm up against two opponents. It makes it somewhat likely that either one of them could have something like a draw on a board like this, and the pot is already 170, so I also want to have the opportunity to take the pot down right here and build the pot, because I can be fairly sure that I have the best hand here. So I just bet out for 100, and this guy check raises to 200. He makes a min raise, and this guy makes the overcall. At this point, it's really an easy decision for me, because the pot is now 670, which is about half my stack at this point. So the pot is really worth picking up at this point. So I can really only do one thing, and that is stack all in here. And the extra reason why I want to do this, not just because the pot is so big and it's worth picking up at this point, but also because I'm up against two very loose and passive slash aggressive fish here. So I can be pretty sure that at least one of them is going to call my all in with a very marginal hand. So it's really important to, whenever you pick up a really big hand like this, that you just play it as fast as you can and not slow play. So resist the temptation of just calling this min raise here or making a smaller 3-bet. It's really important to just get it all in here and count on at least one of them calling the push. So I raise it all in here, and this guy calls, and he calls me with a pair of 6s and a 4 kicker, and he has a gut shot as well. So I was a substantial favorite in his hand, and this is a really good example of playing your hand pretty fast and straightforwardly when you're up against very loose and passive fish who are likely to pay you off with very marginal hands. Here we pick up pocket 5s again on the button, and I'm not really that comfortable open raising this hand because it's not really that strong of a hand to raise here with, even though I can expect to have some amount of fold equity against the opponents that are in the blinds at this point. But let's see what happens. The cutoff actually limps, and he has a VPIP of 53%. He's very loose passive, so it's a perfect spot for me to get involved and limp behind here on the button, where it only costs me 20 extra chips to play. There's no reason to raise here because my hand is nearly not strong enough to do that, and I'm happy to see flop for only 20 chips with 2.5 to 1 pot odds when I'm in position as well. So that's what I do. I limp behind, and the big blind checks. I hit a pretty big flop with bottom set, and the big blind checks, and this guy now leads out for 160. And again, this is really a very good example of a promise to call, because he's betting more than twice the pot here in this case. So he's probably not going to fold if I just stack it all in here. And secondly, what's very important is that I need to avoid cooler cards coming on the turn. His most likely hand range when he bets out for over twice a pot is a weak ace or a king, I think. And he wants to protect his hand against a flush draw. So it's really important that I get the money in as quickly as possible, because if he does have a weak ace or king and there is a club coming on the turn, then I might not get the rest of his stack. And conversely, if he does have a flush draw in this situation, I don't really want a non-club hitting the turn and killing all the action, and he might not give me the rest of his stack either. So considering the fact that he makes a promise to call by overbetting the pot, he is a big fish and he's very passive. And thirdly, I want to avoid any cooler cards coming on the turn and killing all the action. It's really in my best interest to just get the money in here as quickly as possible, and you really shouldn't feel silly about just shoving almost 2,000 chips and into a 230 chips pot, because this is really the way that you have to play this hand, and just get the money in as quickly as possible when you're up against such a loose and passive fish who is likely to pay you off in most cases with a very marginal hand. So that's what I do. I stick it in, and he does call, and he actually had a 10 high flush draw, and we take it down with a full house. So whenever someone makes a promise to call and he's a big fish, just play your hand straightforward and play it as fast as you can, and just get it in with your monster hand as soon as possible. So here we have ace queen offsuit in the big blind, and it gets folded around to the small blind who calls, and he's a gambler, as my holder manager indicates. So he has a pretty high VPIP, 35%, and he's pretty aggressive as well, with an aggression factor of 5.3. And considering the fact that the blinds are so low, I want to raise it up with a hand as strong as ace queen, which tends to be a significant favorite in a blind on blind pot against a very loose player. So that's what I do. I raise it up to 70, and he calls. I hit a perfect flop with trip queens and an ace kicker. There are two hearts out there, but in a heads-up pot, the chance of my opponent actually having a flush draw are only 5%, so I'm not too worried about him having a flush draw. And he actually bets out for close to the pot, 120 chips. And at this point, even though I said in my strategy guide that in low stakes games you should rarely slow play and usually play your hands pretty fast and straightforwardly, this is actually a pretty good spot to slow play your hand because I have a monster hand. I have trip queens with an ace kicker. He's not likely to have that big of a hand anyway because it's very unlikely he has one of the well, the only remaining queen in his hand, so he most likely doesn't have anything here. He might have something like a pocket pair between deuces and queens or something like that, but most likely he doesn't have anything. And secondly, this is a very aggressive player with a 5.3 aggression factor, so with a hand as strong as trip queens with an ace quick kicker, I really want to give him the opportunity to do something stupid and keep on bluffing at the pot. So when I would be up against a very passive player, this would be a pretty good spot to actually raise and try to get the money in as soon as possible, expecting to get called very frequently by worse hands when I would be up against a passive player. But in this spot, this is a perfect opportunity to slow play against a very aggressive player who's likely to keep bluffing at the pot. So that's what I do. I just call his bet, and the turn is an absolute brick, and he just straight ships it for his entire stack. So I'm happy to call that one, and he actually has 9-3 offsuit. So this is a good example of when to slow play, and when you're up against very aggressive opponents who are likely to keep firing at the pot with absolutely nothing, and you have a really big hand that you don't really need to protect on a pretty dry flop, then the best thing you can do is just slow play and be fairly convinced that you get paid off often enough against aggressive opponents who are likely to bluff at the pot very often. So this is a good example of slow playing big hands in low stakes games. Here we pick up a monster hand on the button, pocket queens, and a very aggressive and loose player raises it up to 60. And over 208 hands, he has played 61% of those hands, and he's also very aggressive and raises a lot of hands, 24% pre-flop raise percentage, and my HUD stats tell me that he is a whale. So he's very loose and aggressive and a big fish. And there's a call from another big fish behind him with 64% VPIP. So it's really important with a hand as big as this that you do not slow play and just try to get some more money into the pot when you can expect to have by far the best hand against a very loose and aggressive player opening up from early position. So I make it 220, a healthy sized 3-bet to try and get some money into the pot. And the second guy, the very loose passive guy, actually calls, and it's a pretty good flop for pocket queens. Some low cards and 2 spades out there, but again against one opponent in a heads up pot, he only has a 5% chance of having a flush draw in this pot, so I'm not too worried about that. And he actually checks to me, and this is really a spot where you should not slow play because you're up against a very passive opponent. So what you really want to do in this situation is to try and build the pot and get his entire stack all in by the river. So you really need to make a substantial bet here and not be tempted to slow play and make a very smallish bet of say 150 or 200. But you can really make a big bet here of 340 in this case. So whenever he does call this bet, the pot is going to be something like over 1,000 chips, and I have only 800 behind, and he will have just 600 or 700 behind. So whenever I make a substantial bet like this, I'm committing myself to the pot, and the intention is to get it all in here on a turn and still give my opponent reasonable pot odds. So I bet 340 and he actually calls. The turn is a complete brick, so he checks again. At this point, this is really important that I made a substantial bet on the flop, so to make the pot just as big that I can just stack it all in here and still give my opponent decent pot odds for making a call. So that's what I do. I put in the remainder of my chips, and he calls, and he actually has 10 jack offsuit. So this is a very good example of playing your hand pretty fast and straightforward, and just keep value betting pretty strongly when you're up against a very loose and passive fish. And the whole idea behind this is really to bet such an amount that you are really aiming to get your entire stack in by the river and get paid off. So you really want to build a pot and chunk your stack in, giving your opponent decent pot odds every time, and trying to get your entire stack in by the river. Another monster hand on the button, this time with pocket kings, and a very loose and aggressive player, Limps. He has 92% VPIP and 54% pre-flop raise, so he's extremely loose and aggressive, even though it's only over 24 hands, so the sample size is not that big, but he's played almost all of those 24 hands by having such a high VPIP. So I should really raise it up here and trying to get some more money into the pot when I'm facing such a loose and aggressive player. So I raise it up to 80, and the big blind actually calls, and then this guy makes a min raise. He basically clicks it back at me and puts another 60 chips on top, and at this point the pot is 310 chips, and it's really important to just play your hand as straightforwardly as you possibly can, and just try to get as much chips in the pot as possible. And so that's what I do. I just stack it all in here, and that's really the best play that you can make, because whenever you're facing such a bad loose and aggressive opponent with such a high VPIP and pre-flop raise and aggression factor, I can be pretty confident that he's paying me off here often enough to just make it profitable to shove my entire stack in here and try to get the money all in pre-flop. And this is not a play that many players would make, but it's very important to just do that whenever you are up against such a very loose and aggressive opponent. He might be on a very big hand here because he limped pre-flop and then he's going for the limp re-raise. But against such a weak opponent, I'm not really that worried about him having pocket aces here or some other kind of huge hand. So the only thing I can just really do here is stack it all in, and I'm pretty confident that he's bad enough that he will pay me off often enough to make this overshove profitable in the long run. So I just get it in. He calls, and there's an ace on the flop. This is not so good, but let's see what he has. He has actually king 10 offsuit, so this is really a good example of the fact that these players are so bad that they will usually get it in with very marginal hands, and the best thing you can do is really to play your hand as fast as possible and just get the money in as quickly as you possibly can when you're up against such loose, aggressive, bad opponents like this guy. So pocket kings again. This guy makes it 3x, and he's a pretty big fish, so it seems, with 42% VPIP and PFR of 32, and extremely aggressive post flop. So I want to get some money into the pot and just make it a little less than 3 times the original raise and raise it up to 240. And then a small blind calls. He has a VPIP of almost 40%, and he's very passive with an aggression factor of 1.2, so he could potentially be on a very wide range of hands. So let's see what develops. The original raiser folds, and there's an ace on the flop, and he bets out for 90. Now against a very good opponent, this might be a good spot to raise, because I showed a lot of strength pre-flop by re-raising the original raiser, and it looks really weak actually when he leads out on an ace high flop, and against most opponents you would actually think that the chance of him not having an ace are extremely high here, so you could raise this here, but against a very passive opponent like this with an aggression factor of only 1.2%, I'm actually not that convinced that he doesn't have an ace. With such a low aggression factor, he doesn't bet out all that often, and I wouldn't be all that surprised if he actually did have an ace here in this spot. So there's no reason for me to raise here. I'm not going to fold because my hand is too strong to fold here for just 90 chips, and he's giving me almost 8-1 pot odds, so I'm not really contemplating folding here. But a call really is the best thing that you can do against a very passive player who has, well, where it's pretty likely that he actually can have an ace here. I do hit my money card on the turn with the trip kings, and he bets out for 120. And at this point, I'm just going to call because I'm actually thinking that now that he bets again on a turn, that it's very likely that he has an ace in this spot. So I really want to get the rest of his chips in here on the river, and whenever I call here, the pot is going to be so big that we're both committed anyway. So you could also raise all in here, but I don't think it really matters what you do, because the money is probably going in anyway against a passive opponent showing some strength, and he's not going to fold if he has an ace, which seems increasingly likely at this point. So I'm just going to call, and he bets out 390, and I'm just going to put him in for the rest of his chips. And he calls, and he actually did have an ace. So even with big hands like this, it's important to stay cautious whenever such a passive player bets out, and you have to be worried about him actually having an ace on this ace high flop. So still remain cautious against loose passive fish betting out, and just trying to be a little bit more careful when you have a big hand and there's an overcard on the flop, like in this spot. So alright, let's go to the next hand where I pick up ace king offsuit, and under the gun folds, and of course I'm going to raise it up here. I'm just going to make a standard 3x raise, let's see what develops. And this guy just goes all in, and this I think is a very good example again of when to get it in pre-flop with ace king, because this opponent is very aggressive post-flop with an aggression factor of 11.7, and he's pretty loose passive pre-flop with 58% VPIP over 390 hands. So it's a very poor opponent. He is very loose and aggressive, and it's very likely that whenever he stacks it just all in pre-flop, that he has a hand that I dominate, such as ace queen or ace jack. He's most likely not doing this with a hand like queens, kings, or aces, I think. So just because his opponent is so bad, it makes it profitable to get it all in pre-flop with ace king here, because of the fact that I can expect to be crushing the majority of his range. Now, if this opponent were better, let's say he would have like HUD stats more comparable to the under gun guys, such as a VPIP of 17% and pre-flop raise of 12%, then it would be an entirely different story, because my ace king is not looking all that good, and I'm probably up against at least jacks, queens, kings, or aces. So but in this case, my opponent is so bad that I'm pretty happy to just get it all in here with ace king and expect to be crushing his range pretty heavily. So I make the call, and he did have ace queen. So this is really a good example of when to get it in pre-flop with ace king, and it's perfectly fine to do that against very bad opponents who are likely to get all in pre-flop with a lot of hands that you crush. Here we pick up deuces in the small blind, and the cutoff limps, and this is really a good spot to just limp behind to complete the small blind, because I'm getting really good pot odds of 5-1, and I'm relatively short stacked, but I still have enough chips to just complete here and see a flop. I really hit a good flop with bottom set, and this is really a good spot to slow play again and not play your hand pretty straightforwardly and fast. just because of the fact that the pot is already at 150 chips and I only have 765 behind. So the pot already represents a decent percentage of my stack, and whenever I bet out here, say 100 or 75 chips or something like that, it looks like a pretty threatening bet because my stack is so short that my opponents are probably going to realize that I do have some kind of a hand and that it's not very likely that I'm going to fold if they raise me. So considering that I'm so short stacked and I have a pretty big hand here, it's much better to just check and see if one of my opponents bets here. It gets checked around and the turn brings queen. At this point I really want to get some money into the pot because of the fact that I'm very short stacked and I really want to seize the opportunity to get some chips here and hope that either one of my opponents has a king or a queen. So I'm just going to bet out for half the pot, and I get a call and another call, and the river is the queen, which is a pretty interesting card because I have there's 375 in the pot right now and I have 690 left, so that's just about 2 times the pot that I have left here. And considering this board, it's really important that I just try to get the money in here as quickly as possible, because if one of my opponents has a queen, he's not going to fold. So it doesn't really matter what I bet here. If I bet small, like 200 or 300, or if I just go all in, when my opponent has a queen, he's going to call anyway. So it really doesn't matter whether I bet small or big. Secondly, when one of my opponents has a king, I'm pretty confident that he will also call an all-in bet, because it might seem a little bit of a desperation move when I just go all in, and I think I can be pretty confident that he will call me with a pair of kings as well here. So considering the fact that the only hands that are going to call my bet are probably going to call an all-in as much as they're going to call a smaller bet, the best thing I can do really here is to just go all in here and play it fast. And I do get called by trip queens, so this is really one of the hands that, well, probably the money was going in anyway. If I had bet smaller, he probably would have put me all in. But the most important thing here is that when the board is such that you can expect a small bet just as often to be called as a big bet, that you just go for the big bet, and that is really the most profitable thing that you can do in that situation. So just stack it all in here for twice the pot and expect to be called by either either a king or a queen. So here we have Queen Jack offsuit in the small blind, and it gets folded around to us, and this is a perfectly good hand to raise, but considering the situation, it's much better to limp this hand, I think, because as you can find in my strategy guide, there are a lot of low stakes opponents who over adjust to their stack size in low stakes games, and in this particular instance I'm up against a pretty big stack with over 4,000 chips at the 2550 level, and low stakes opponents with such a big stack are very often trying to run the table over and trying to take down every single pot, and it's really important to keep that in mind, because they tend to over adjust to their stack and tend to get very aggressive and try to take down every pot and bluff a lot and try to take you off the hand. So against a big stack like this, it's much better to just limp here and see what develops, rather than raising a pretty good hand, because if I raise here, he might just re-raise me and I have to get rid of the hand, or he's going to call and there's going to be a pretty big pot, and he's going to try and take it away from me very often post flop by trying to bluff at it. So the best thing to do against a very big stack here is to just play it safe and call the extra 25 chips and see what develops. I hit top pair with a jack kicker, so that's a pretty good hand, and I just need to bet out for value here, and to protect my hand I have a backdoor straight draw as well, but I really have to protect against a king or an ace coming on a turn, and I'm betting out for value as well here because he's a big stack, so he can afford to just call and splash around with a lot of chips, and that's usually what a lot of low stakes opponents do. Whenever they have a big stack, they tend to play a lot of hands and just make calls with very marginal hands. So he does call, in fact, and the turn is pretty harmless. It's a 5, so I can just make another value bet here and see what he does. And he calls again, and there's another pretty harmless card on the river. Jack 9 got there for a straight, but I'm not really worried about him having an open-ended straight draw because he probably would have played it a little bit more aggressively on the flop. So the best thing to do here really is to check and induce a bluff. And this is really important, that is the best way to get value from your hand here, because this guy has such a big stack that whenever I check, he will probably be very tempted to bluff at the pot and try and take it down with a weaker hand than I have. So if I were up against a very passive opponent, this would be a good spot to just bet out and expect to get called by a lot of worse hands. But in this case, against a very aggressive opponent who has also a very big stack, he's very likely to try and bluff at the pot and try and take it down if I just check it here. So I check, and he bets 350. That is enough for me to just go for the check call, and there's not really a reason for me to check raise all in, because that's displaying such an amount of strength that he's probably not going to call me with a worse hand anyway. So I'm just going to call, and he actually had Queen 4 offsuit. So against aggressive opponents with very big stacks, the best thing to do really is to play it safe, try to keep the pot under control, not raise pre-flop with a good hand, and just see if you can hit something and get paid off. And also use the fact that big stacks are often going to bluff at a lot of pots when there are pretty bad low stakes opponents. With ace-king suited here in the cutoff, it's a perfectly good hand to raise, of course, so I just make it 3x. And I get called by, well, I was actually in the hijack position, and I get called by the cutoff here. And looking at his HUD stats, he seems like a decent player with 23% VPIP. And he actually folds his big blind 100% of the time, so he's probably got some kind of a hand here when he calls my pre-flop raise. So it gets folded around, and I hit a pretty big flop with 2 overcards and a flush draw. Against a passive player, I think the best thing to do here is to just bet out and try to build a pot when you have such a big hand with so many outs, because I have 9 outs for the flush and I have 6 outs for my ace or king, so that gives me 15 outs, and I'm a 60% favorite over 2 cards to come. So I'm actually favored against any pair on this board, or even any overpair like 10s, jacks, or queens. So the best thing to do, however, against an aggressive opponent is to just check here and go for the check raise, because he's so aggressive that he's probably going to bet out here when I check to him. And even when he checks behind, this is not that big of a problem because I still have a monster hand. And if he checks behind, I get a free card, and that's a good scenario as well, because I can hit either an ace or a king or another club. So checking here against an aggressive opponent is really the best option to take here. So when he checks behind, it's a pretty good scenario because I get a free card, and when he bets out, I can just check raise him, and I'm pretty happy to get my money all in here with such a big hand, where I am a big favorite over any other hand really. So let's see what happens. He does bet out because he's very aggressive. This was likely to happen, and at this point the pot is 575, so that's around half my stack, and he just has 800 behind. So there's only really one thing I can do here, and that is just to stack it all in. And I'm pretty happy to take it all in here, and wouldn't even mind if he calls, because I stand to be a big favorite anyway. So, but he folds, and I take down a pretty nice pot. So here we have 10-4 suited in the big blind. And there's a limp and another limp there, and there's nothing to do here really but check, because my hand is pretty garbage, and there's no reason to raise all in here, even though I can expect to be facing players with a very wide range of hands. This guy open limping at the 5100 level, that's pretty bad to do that, and but he's a bit of a calling station with a 39% VPIP, so he's used to limping a lot, and even during higher blinds he's likely to limp a lot of hands. This is actually a pretty good flop for me, because there are two kings out there, so it makes it less likely that either one of them has a king. And I have a pair of tens, and it's pretty likely to be the best hand on this flop, so it's very important actually to bet out here. And a lot of players would actually just check here and give up if someone bets, but really this is a very good spot to just bet out here, because the small blind checks, and I really have to protect my hand because it's likely best now, but it's very vulnerable at the same time. I don't really want to have a jack, queen, or ace come on a turn and ruin my hand, so I really have to bet out for value here, because it's probably going to be the best hand, and I have to protect my hand at the same time. Another thing that is important to mention here is that my stack is a little under 1,000 chips, and the pot is already 300 chips. So whenever I do make a bet here, it looks pretty threatening to my opponents, because if I bet out 150, I leave myself with 830 left, and this should really send a message to my opponents that I'm probably not going to fold if they raise all in here, or if they decide to call or make a smaller raise. So it looks pretty threatening betting out here for half the pot with such a small stack, and I can expect to take it down very frequently when I bet out here. So resist the temptation of just checking here, because you're going to have to give up if it is checked around and there's a bad turn card, or whenever the original limper bets, you might have to give it up as well, and your hand is not strong enough to check raise here, so it's really important to just bet out here and try and take it down. So they both fold, and we take the pot down. Alright, that was the last hand. I hope you enjoyed. If you have any questions, hit me up on the forum, and I'll see you next time.